The communists seek to break down all morality, all tradition, and to destroy the whole spiritual and aesthetic sense of values which we have inherited. A reverent continuity in human affairs is of extreme importance, and that even the most desirable change should be made cautiously in order to be sure that it constitutes improvement.
For the intellectual neo-Marxists that came to power in the West during the 1960s and 70s, no front of the culture wars has been more important than the national question. What constitutes a nation, the benefits and costs of nationhood, the connections between national identity and its interests, ethnic and racial differences, and the proper relations between nation-state, immigration, and domestic ethnic enclaves. 4 of the 5 taboos in the social sciences are related directly or indirectly to the issues of race differences, blaming the victim, stereotype accuracy, and nativism. These matters were, from well before the Bolshevik coup of 1917, a primary concern of cosmopolitan intellectuals who fought against any beliefs that would bolster Western identity or confidence. One such activist was Columbia University anthropology professor Franz Boas, who helped supplant the nascent biosocial sciences in the United States with the liberal New Social Sciences. Boas's opposition to biosocial science was valorized as scientific anti-racism, pioneered in a famous publication of 1912 entitled The History of the American Race. The research purported to demonstrate that races rapidly converge on a common type when living in the same country. His goal was to assuage Anglo-American concerns that mass immigration would alter national identity. Boas, who descended from a long line of Jewish German Enlightenment thinkers, was so strongly motivated in this direction that he opposed all biological theories of human nature, and to that end he abandoned rigorous academic standards. Despite evincing the values of the 1848 French liberal revolutionaries, he remained a stalwart of the Soviet Union, even through the Holodomor, the Ukrainian genocide of 1932, in which over 6 million people died. On the scientific side, he doggedly supported official Soviet Lamarckianism, the theory that characteristics acquired by individuals during their lifetimes are passed on genetically to children, and Boas remained a Lamarckian long after the theory was discredited within scientific circles. Later in his career, he approved of Margaret Mead's deeply flawed doctoral thesis on Samoan teenage sexuality that attributed white puberty blues to negative pathologies of Western civilization. His 1912 research, a keystone document in the effort to radicalize American social science, has been recently shown to be fallacious, not only in the data collected by junior colleagues, but in the statistical analysis conducted by Boas himself, despite his being a master statistician. Subsequent attacks on biosocial conceptions of ethnicity and nationhood have frequently been tempted to trade truth for ideology. This doesn't try to suggest that pioneer left-wing social scientists were Soviet agenteurs, but they were certainly sympathetic to Marxist utopianism. For example, John Dewey, held by Canadian sociologist Eric Kaufmann to have co-founded the New Social Sciences with Boas, was not a Stalinist, neither was he a revolutionary. But he did move in far-left circles, and in 1937 chaired the Commission of Inquiry into the charges made against Leon Trotsky in the Moscow trials, organized by a Trotskyist front organization that included Boas. And of course, the commission concluded that Trotsky had been loyal to the revolution. A century after Boas, the flaws in Marxist economics are now fully understood, but the communist doctrine regarding the nationalist question is triumphant. This is manifested intellectually in a near absence of biology in media and academic discussions. Politically, it is evident in the intolerant utopianism of multiculturalism, revolutionary levels of replacement immigration, and censorship of free speech on the subject. The loss of this front in the culture wars has unhinged the West's political leadership in its capacity to comprehend ethnic affairs in a growingly diverse and sinister world. This very same liberal political class that was surprised when the Soviet Union broke up in its constituent nations because it didn't regard it as a Marxist empire consisting of captive nations praying for release, is also now managing the progressive swamping of Western nations by mass non-white immigration. The policy is baffling from an evolutionary perspective because it is drastically reducing the collective survival fitness of ethnic European populations. Not everything about the process is new. Displacement of populations through colonization has been happening since time immemorial, but usually on a much smaller scale. What distinguishes the present situation throughout much of the West is that it was not initiated by armed invasion. Instead, colonization is occurring at the invitation of the Western elites, contrary to the majority of public opinion, and the process is epochal, whether viewed through zoological, national, or democratic eyes. Furthermore, it is also supported by all of the cultural and political institutions that control Western civilization at present. Ethnic minorities are routinely represented by university-educated elites with access to the mass media and governmental commissions, while the ethnic majority is usually not. The class difference corresponds with the institutional support, such that minority advocates are privileged by the establishment, while majority advocates are excluded. Minority ethnic activists are treated with deference by government, the media, universities, and corporations. They receive positive media coverage, soft jobs, and other perks from the multicultural and immigration industry. They are invited to participate in government forums, while political parties often favor them for pre-selection as a means of attracting the so-called ethnic vote. Activist lawyers volunteer strategy and legal services. Any peccadillos and indiscretions are overlooked and omitted in the media's reportage. By contrast, majority activists are derided by the media, university experts, minority activists, and government officials. There are no jobs for advocates of European interests in the multicultural industry or in Western governmental agencies. They are not invited to governmental forums. Lawyers demand full payment. European advocacy can sabotage careers, while peccadillos and indiscretions become the whole story. Throughout the West, efforts continue to legislate ever harsher penalties for expressions of loyalty to shrinking white majorities. Vilification of ethnic consciousness helps perpetuate this difference. The resulting stigma helps silence the professional class that would otherwise be marshaled into a powerful electoral and cultural defense league for the historical European nations. The class difference between minority and majority ethnic advocates has been instrumental in the top-down demographic revolution now underway across the Western world. And this happens in democracies when elites have become alienated from the founding national stock. One of the first casualties in this process is a consideration of human nature, which would act as a deterrent to the modern wave of millenarian socialism. In the United States example, this changing of the intellectual guard occurred in the 1950s, having already been apparent since the 20s and 30s with the rise of the anti-Anglo ideology dressed up as anti-racism. That was the initial tipping point. The Gramscian process came full circle, as graduates of elite universities conveyed the cosmopolitan cultural Marxist agenda to the federal government, including the executive, the Supreme Court, and senior levels of the bureaucracy. The alienation of the state from the nation left heritage Americans without effective leadership, and thus ill-equipped institutionally or financially to contest control of centralized government, education, and media, while the remainder of the 20th century saw the mopping up of uncoordinated pockets of Anglo-European descent. One rearguard action was flight from the mainstream churches to evangelical denominations whose preachers were not the products of Ivy League colleges or adherents of progressive ecumenicalism, the other being white flight, where droves of heritage Americans were forced out into rural areas in a desperate attempt to redevelop their previous cultural contract, only to be followed relentlessly by migrant placement quotas and land use restrictions. Despite such resistance, the top-down march of cosmopolitan socialist ideas has had a general indoctrination effect. The ability of old generational European Americans to resist electorally was steadily eroded by the mass immigration of those whose ethnic and economic interests usually lay with the Democrats, the party of generous welfare, diversity enthusiasm, and porous borders. This pattern also became the model for all other Western nations with mass non-European immigration, where the desire to betray the native European populations arose from the liberal and neo-Marxist establishment's need for new voting blocs, and therewith the political manifestation of white genocide became the new charter for all mainstream politics. So, with no political or social advantage given under these new cultural conditions, where the mathematics of democratic process will now no longer allow for any power at any level to the undermined European ethnic groups, what are their options for self-realization, other than a long, drawn-out fight that shall be contested for generations, and one that will pile heaps of countless bodies, from one dark horizon to the other?